So good morning, everyone. My name is Ben Borkel. I serve as the MICIP lead for professional learning, and also working with us today is Dr. Terry Nugent, who is the MICIP lead. And before we get into the presentation, we also want to acknowledge the contributions of Kathy Miller from Shiawassee ISD, as well as Dodie Raycraft, who is retired from Kalamazoo Public Schools. So our learning outcomes for today are the three that you see on the slide. First of all, to understand the purpose and role of monitor and adjust. Secondly, to identify tools that can be used for monitor and adjust. And finally, to understand how monitor and adjust work in the MICIP platform. So if you have built a plan in MICIP, you have developed a data story. You've identified a root cause for the data that then resulted in writing your challenge statement, and you developed an action plan with end and interim targets, as well as strategies and activities to address the challenge. And so it's now time to begin implementing the plan. However, before doing so, you might want to check to ensure that you built monitoring activities into the plan as well. So in previous iterations of the continuous improvement cycle, you might recall that monitoring was not called out as a separate component. However, our research showed that in previous improvement efforts, while there were many strategies and activities taking place, monitoring was not necessarily an integral part of that process, with the result that adjustments were not being made based on data and plans were not getting the results that they had hoped for. And as the slide notes, monitoring is an essential part of the MICIP process. However, we know that monitoring does not just happen once. Rather, the MICIP process is a series of implementation cycles with multiple opportunities for monitoring, and each monitoring component informs the next cycle. So monitoring is defined as systematically reviewing the progress of the implementation and impact of actions. So note also the three quotes regarding monitoring. So first, the minute you start implementing, you start monitoring. What gets monitored gets done, and plan for your monitoring and monitor what you plan. So monitoring helps us answer a number of questions, including those noted on this slide. So first of all, do we know what is working? Do we know what may not be getting the intended impact? Do we know why we are getting the results we are getting? And how do we know? Do we need to adjust? And if so, what adjustments are needed? So monitoring is the responsibility of both the district and the school, but each has a slightly different role. So first, schools or programs are responsible for monitoring the programs and initiatives that have been assigned to them, and then reporting the data back to the district continuous improvement team. The district is responsible for collecting the data from its schools and collating it to develop a district-wide picture. And the district may also have plans that are assigned only to it, which it then needs to monitor. And both the schools and the district should engage in the analysis of the data regarding the goals, strategies, and activities assigned to them. You notice in the yellow box, the statement, evidence is critical. This later impacts conversations about adjusting, because we want to make decisions based on data rather than just on personal hunches. Note also the question at the bottom of this slide. How will you ensure that the monitoring process is consistent across entities monitoring the same thing? For example, across different buildings, grade levels, or classrooms. Doing this requires having the same tools and understanding about what it looks like and sounds like in practice. And it also requires having ongoing conversations between those who are doing the monitoring. So there are a number of things to keep in mind when monitoring. First, monitoring must be considered in every part of the continuous improvement process, not just when you're starting the monitoring process. So first of all, during assess needs, the data that's chosen for the data story should later be able to be used for monitoring, so we know if any impact is being made. During the planning process, the strategies and activities that are identified will need to be monitored for implementation. And it's critical to identify the monitoring activities and timelines as part of designing the plan itself. Monitoring is also essential during implementation to know whether the plan is working. And evaluation is essentially the summative part of monitoring, and the monitoring data will then be used to inform evaluation. Secondly, monitoring informs the movement between stages of implementation, whether forward or backward, whether by the whole district or by individual schools or programs. Thirdly, monitoring confirms or contradicts the theory of change and logic model that is reflected in the challenge statement. Monitoring supports adjusting the plan based on data on an as-needed basis, rather than waiting until valuable time has been wasted or something that is not working. It's also likely that the adjustments will need to be minor during monitoring compared to those needed after much more time has passed. Fifth, monitoring supports and meets the federal evaluation requirements for programs using federal funds. Although it's called program evaluation, the ongoing evaluation process is really monitoring, with evaluation just being the summative endpoint. It's important to keep in mind that monitoring may look different depending on the primary focus of the goal, as well as the stage of implementation. For example, an academic goal is likely to primarily have achievement targets, while a non-academic goal is more likely to have behavior or attitude targets for impact. A systems goal is likely to have more implementation targets until the end target that will likely then also include student impact. And while not required, we encourage districts to consider all three kinds of data for a complete data story. When considering stages of implementation and impact are likely to have different meanings in the installation stage as compared to an implementation stage, as an example. Not only should districts monitor the specific actions in a plan, they should also monitor the effectiveness of the systems themselves to support those actions, whether the goal is a systems goal or not. And finally, while it is critical to monitor the individual actions in a plan, it's also important to monitor the entire continuous improvement process, both for implementation as well as for impact. This slide reminds us that monitoring and evaluation activities include those that are both adult and student focused, with implementation being primarily focused on the adults and impact being focused on students. Again, monitoring is that formative process, while evaluation is the summative process. So as reminded in the previous slide, monitoring and evaluation in MICIP are focused on the same things, with implementation being focused on capacity, fidelity, and scale and reach, and impact being focused on impact. Again, monitoring must be considered in every part of the continuous improvement promise. Note that the questions that are part of each component are identical in this case, except for the tenses of the verbs. So the monitoring tenses are in present. The evaluation tenses are in the past. So one of the quotes for which Henry Ford is famous is the one on this slide. If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. And this is especially true when it comes to adult behavior. So in terms of continuous improvement, if we want student outcomes to change, we first need to change adult behavior. And referencing the quote several slides back of what gets monitored gets done, if we want adult behavior to change, we need to monitor whether it is indeed changing. So when identifying a continuous improvement strategy, there are two key questions a district must answer. First, is it the right thing to do? And secondly, can we do it the right way? If the answer to either of these questions is no, we might need to consider choosing something different. Assuming the two questions on the previous page about whether it's the right thing to do and whether we can do it the right way can be answered affirmatively, and the district chooses to move ahead with the identified strategy or initiative, there are several things to keep in mind about the components of implementation and impact. First of all, the three implementation components are interdependent. So for example, if you do not have capacity, you'll not be able to implement to the scale and reach that you want, or to implement to the level of fidelity required by research or evidence. And all three implementation components determine impact. So if any of the three of those are missing, or if they're weak, impact will be affected. And so as a result, all three aspects of implementation need to be monitored. However, it's also not required to monitor all three aspects every time you monitor. So in the next three slides, we're going to review the definition of each and also look at the various tools that can be used. So we begin with capacity, since it directly impacts fidelity and scale and reach. On this slide, note the definition of capacity according to the National Implementation Research Network, or NIRN, as well as the question that's posed in MICIP as part of the monitoring process. So the definition: systems, activities, and resources that are necessary to successfully adopt and sustain effective practices, supports, and interventions. And the question: so what progress are we making in supporting those implementing the plan with sufficient human, financial, technology, material, and time resources? The tool on this slide identifies some of the major components of capacity as identified in the NIRN hexagon tool. If following the MICIP process, the district will already have used the hexagon tool to identify its capacity as part of the planning process using the questions on the left. So the district may have decided that it has or can build the capacity to move ahead, even though all components may not be in place. So as part of planning, it's important for the district to identify any actions that must be implemented to fill gaps and to ensure that the district has capacity to implement a strategy at the highest level of fidelity. While this tool is primarily meant for planning, we can also use it to identify whether or not we have followed through on the activities we have identified through the planning process related to capacity. And the chart on the right is just a simple chart that identifies the individual elements, describes their current status, and then describes what needs to be done as a result of that current status. There are two other tools that can help measure capacity as well. So the district capacity assessment, sometimes referred to as the DCA, can be used to measure the district's capacity to implement an initiative. So while sometimes associated only with MTSS, it can actually be used to assess the capacity to implement any initiative. The driver's best practice assessment is similar to the DCA, but is designed to be used by schools and identifies how well a school is making best use of the practices defined by implementation drivers, as well as what data you will need to collect around those drivers. My MTSS data is now integrated into MICIP. A MICIP administrator will need to enable the MyMTSS access under third-party integrations in the platform. And if you need assistance with that, you can contact Terry Nugent, who can help you with that. So moving on to Fidelity. So Fidelity monitoring is needed at two levels, both the strategy level as well as at the plan level. Note again the definition of fidelity on this slide, as well as the key question asked in MICIP. So the definition, the degree to which a strategy or plan is implemented as intended according to research or evidence, and the question, what progress are we making on implementing the selected strategy or plan as intended? Probably one of the most important tools for fidelity of implementation is the Strategy Implementation Guide, sometimes referred to as the SID. Note the statements on this slide regarding the guide. The Strategy Implementation Guide bridges the gap between research and implementation. This protocol or tool is how stakeholders involved with implementation understand the expectations for what and how to execute implementation with fidelity so that we can receive maximum impact. So let's take a look at the features of such a guide. So you'll notice in the first column, we're asked to identify the critical components of the strategy. And these are practices that, according to research or evidence, must be in place to be able to implement the strategy with fidelity. In the second column, we describe the expected behaviors regarding implementation of those components with the highest level of fidelity. Sometimes we refer to those as the gold standard. In the third column, we identify any acceptable variations. In other words, if we cannot implement at the level of the gold standard, acceptable variations are those that should still bring the desired results. So for example, if a literacy strategy calls for 45 minutes of reading instruction 5 days a week, but a school schedule will not allow that, might implementing reading instruction for 60 minutes or more on 2 of those days be an acceptable variation? There may be instances where a strategy is so tight that there might not be acceptable variations. Sometimes we also talk about acceptable variations as those variations that need to be made to the specific location to be able to implement the strategy. In the last column, we identify unacceptable variations, or those practices that should not be implemented. It's important to explicitly identify such practices so there is no question about whether they are allowable. And if a strategy cannot be implemented at least the acceptable variation level, it's likely a sign that it may be necessary to choose a different strategy. And if the strategy is a complex strategy with several components, it's advisable that we develop a strategy implementation guide for each of those components. Now, it would be ideal for an entire staff to help develop a strategy implementation guide. However, if that's not practical and the guide must be developed by a smaller group of people, it's important that the guide be brought to the entire staff for input or feedback so that eventually all staff members agree on the elements of the guide and what they look and sound like in implementation. And again, while it's ideal to have all 4 columns completed for such a guide, you could start with the first 2 columns. This slide shows a strategy implementation template that has been modified to include just the critical components and the gold standard. So it's important to keep in mind that the more detailed you are regarding implementation details, including defining the what, the who, the how often, and so on for your specific context, the more likely you will set the stage for successful implementation. It's also important to remember that depending on the strategy, implementation of all critical components may end up taking more than just the first year. So our colleagues from Shiawassee and Clinton County Regional Educational Service Agencies have graciously shared examples of some additional implementation guides that they developed in their county that you might find helpful as you look for samples in your own work. So this slide shows an example of a possible strategy implementation monitoring tool that's tied to the strategy implementation guide. So whoever is doing the monitoring would note the grade level or content area, the date, and the individual being monitored. The evidence of implementation then would be identified using the implementation guide, noting which elements are present and which are lacking. Depending on the evidence, follow-up might include additional professional learning or coaching if the level of implementation was low, or providing professional learning and coaching to others if the level of implementation was high. Important thing to note is that this tool is strictly meant for monitoring and should not be used for personal evaluation. It's also important to note that if you're in a small building, you want to be careful of assigning specific results to specific individuals. Again, this isn't for public consumption. This is for broad application. You'll notice on the right side, the summary report that just indicates, for example, numbers. And again, if you have 1 person per grade level, that's something that you might want to eliminate. Again, this isn't about individual evaluation. This is about looking for overall components and setting new targets in terms of improving implementation. So a tool like this could be used on a variety of scales, including for individual reflection, for grade or content area reflection, or for whole school reflection. Monitoring the plan also involves knowing whether we are implementing the correct activities for the stage that we are in. So this requires a knowledge of the stages as outlined on this slide. Note the description of each stage of implementation, starting with exploration, where we examine the degree to which a particular program or innovation meets the district's needs and whether implementation is feasible. We then move to installation, where we ensure that resources for implementation are in place and develop practitioner competency. We next move to initial implementation, where we first put the strategy in place and then identify solutions to any barriers for implementation. And finally, we move to full implementation, where we fully implement the initiative or move from implementation on a limited scale to a full scale. Assuming a district or building has a variety of initiatives, it's likely that they will be in different stages of implementation at different times, and therefore monitoring for each initiative will look different based on the stage. NERN has developed the implementation stages planning tool that describes the various actions and behaviors that should take place at each stage. And along with the tool on the next slide, the stages planning tool will help identify the activities that a district may need to consider as part of its plan. So the activity planning tool helps identify activities that support implementation for each stage. So monitoring implementation of the plan includes monitoring the implementation of the various selected activities to determine if they're being implemented by their due dates. And while the activity planning tool is intended to primarily be used to plan activities for the various stages, it can also be used as a reflection tool to identify gaps in planning or implementation throughout the monitoring process. Note that the tool asks the user to identify not only activities for implementation or installation, but also for monitoring and evaluation. It's critical that these monitoring and evaluation activities be considered as part of the planning process and not just when the time comes for monitoring or evaluation. Note the statements to the left of the chart that as part of the planning process, the activities should be identified for the entire life of the plan, even though they may not be implemented during the first year. Doing so helps keep implementation on track and also facilitates the budget process for the life of the plan. The monitoring process helps note that whether the implementation is on track and whether the budget is being expended as planned. And this tool is tied to the activity planning tool and is an example of a simple activity monitoring tool. So it's important to decide on the monitoring calendar when the monitoring process is being planned. So there's nothing remarkable about this. It's just an example of a tool that you might be able to use to identify your activities, when you're monitoring them, how you're monitoring, and who's doing the monitoring, as well as any implementation that you're collecting that later on could be transferred right into the MICIP platform. And this slide just shows another example of an activity monitoring tool that's aligned to the activity planning tool. And this slide is, or this document is linked at the link at the bottom of this. And again, it allows you to just maybe more completely mark where you're at in terms of each stage of implementation of these various activities. Terry, I'll let you continue.
Love to. All right, let me share their screen. Ben, can you see?
Okay.
Excellent. All right, everyone. Again, I'm Terry Nugent. I am the MICIP lead with the Michigan Department of Education. We're going to continue with our strategy monitoring and look at the last implementation component, and that is scale and reach. Note the description and the questions raised point to two areas: whether the plan is reaching the intended populations, as well as whether the appropriate stage is being implemented given the status and timeline of the plan. There we go. Monitoring scale and reach regarding the target population might be as simple as a checklist or a series of questions, such as those on this slide. Note again the importance of evidence. So what is your evidence? A simple document such as this one on the slide can be used to address the questions on the previous slide. And so you see here it's easily made and breaks down the different components. So here, equity is a part of the MICIP mindset that impacts the entire process, and equity is directly related to scale and reach. The questions on this slide address just a few of the high-level considerations if a district is using an equity lens in its continuous improvement process. For example, to what extent are all students equitably benefiting from the stages and from the strategies and activities? Are we addressing problematic policies, practices, and structures that are barriers to equitable outcomes? Are we collecting perception data, from those impacted by our educational practices. And what does that tell us? If we are considering adjustments based on our data, how will we ensure that it will not have unintentional negative consequences, especially on a specific population? If a district commits to addressing gaps in equity, it is critical to monitor any action identified to address those gaps. As previously mentioned, scale and reach can also include whether you are in the correct stage. Monitoring will look different depending on the stage you are in. Monitoring in the installation stage will likely be more about checking the boxes regarding whether you had done something versus the quality of the implementation. As with so many of our planning tools, the NERN implementation states planning tool can also be used for monitoring. While it is important to monitor the actions in our plans, it is also critical to monitor the systems that are necessary to support the implementation of those actions. Ideally, any gaps in such systems would also be addressed through the continuous improvement plan. And just take a minute to think about, what does that look like in your situation? To be able to measure systems effectively, it is important that a district have a framework with an aligned assessment tool to use as a reference point. The tool should include a description of the various systems, as well as the components of what the systems should include. This slide suggests a few of the frameworks that might be used, including the MDE District Improvement Framework, or known as the DIF, the Whole Child Framework, the Blueprint, Cognia, and MTSS. The systems monitoring document is an example of the kinds of questions that might be asked regarding various systems. As mentioned earlier in this presentation, the NERN hexagon tool helps us answer the two key questions. One, is this the right thing to do? And two, can we do it the right way? Note that the green components, supports, evidence, and usability, are primarily characteristics of an initiative and helps us answer the first question, while the blue components, capacity, fit, need, are primary characteristics of the implementation site and help us answer the second question, can we do it the right way? The district is asked to rate itself on 6 components. It is very important that when using the hexagon tool, the district is honest in its scores so that it can accurately represent the district's position. Low scores on any of the components do not necessarily mean that an initiative cannot be implemented, so long as the district believes that it can be addressed, it can address the gaps through activities. As part of the monitoring process, it is important to look at the hexagon tool score and consider if you have addressed the areas that scored low and whether you are moving in a positive direction while assuming that the areas are scored high remain high. In summary, all 3 components of implementation are critical to each other and to impact, and therefore need to be monitored. And you will see this icon throughout the MICIP platform to help you understand where you are in terms of monitoring and evaluation. Now let's look at impact. The final monitoring component is impact, and it's primarily defined by progress on end and interim targets. The type of goal a plan includes will determine the type of end and interim targets. As we have been saying, all 3 aspects of implementation help determine impact. Note that an end target is a value that defines the ultimate level of achievement of a measurable goal, however that goal is defined. An interim target measure progress towards the measured goal and can be defined as either a value that measures progress towards the ultimate impact or progress towards implementation. For example, it might mean moving from the 25th percentile to the 50th percentile achievement, or it could mean the percentage of staff that have been trained in implementing a strategy towards getting all staff trained. This chart shows examples of various kinds of data that might be used to build a data story, and then for monitoring. While it is not required for a data story to include data from all categories, it is recommended that a district at least consider data in all three of these areas. This slide shows how a data story, and consequently monitoring, might consider data from 4 types. You'll see outcome, demographic, process, and perception. As a district considers data, it is also encouraged to explore the 3 levels of data as described in the book Street Data. This includes satellite data or large grain size data that typically includes state and national assessments. Map data or medium grain size that allows us to dig more deeply and might include data about specific skill areas. And street data that is garnered to talking to those being impacted by the data we are collecting. While street data can be gathered through various instruments such as surveys, it is preferred that it be gathered by speaking directly to the individuals being impacted. These simple tables such as this might be used to keep track of the various types of data being collected and to identify gaps that might need to be filled. This sheet shows a much more sophisticated spreadsheet that might be used for monitoring the various kinds and types. Districts can map out the assessments and measures they will use to monitor, having ongoing, incremental, easy to understand reports are necessary to adequately monitor. Our colleagues at Shastawasi and Clinton County RESA developed and shared this template. The document is also hyperlinked in this slide. This slide illustrates a practice that districts might find helpful in looking at data. Charting the data in a way that indicates a baseline, the goal line, and progressions towards the goal gives a quick visual representation of progress and is easily shareable. So what does monitoring look like in MICIP? As mentioned in the previous slide, for each strategy, you are asked to reflect on the following. Capacity. What progress are we making on supporting completion of the strategies and activities by the due dates with sufficient human, financial, technology, material, and time resources? And of course, what is the evidence? Next is implementation with Fidelity. What progress are we making on implementing the selected strategies as intended? What is the evidence as suggested by the strategy implementation guide? Next is scale and reach. What progress are we making on reaching the intended population? For example, the number of schools, the teachers, grade level students, etc. To what extent are we implementing the intended stage of implementation? Exploration, installation, initial implementation, or full implementation? Are we clear on what success should look like for that stage? And of course, what is the evidence for that? Note that evidence comes in many forms, including both anecdotal as well as numerical. Also note that you do not need to reflect on each question each time you monitor. By clicking on the Create Note button, you will have an opportunity to create a note with any information. Each time you record a note, it will be stamped with the name of the author and the date when the note was entered. It is critical that you not only summarize your thinking, but also cite the evidence. Any type of evidence can be added to a Create Note box. Notes can be edited by clicking on the pencil. To streamline the monitoring process, both district and school teams can add notes to the platform, with the school teams identifying their notes with the name of their school. For example, Star Elementary Progress Note. Note that notes can be revised, but they cannot be totally deleted. To measure impact, you will return to the monitoring page with the goal name and go to the impact section. You will see the interim and end targets associated with the goal, and you are asked to answer the question, what progress are we making on the interim and end targets? What is the evidence? Write your reflection in the box by clicking on Create Note. Each time you record a note, it will be stamped as before with a name and author, date when it's noted was entered. It is critical that you not only summarize your thinking, but also cite the evidence. Only interim target measures can be viewed and checked for completion on this page. During the monitoring process, you will periodically want to consider whether you need to make any adjustments based on evidence. You can adjust in 4 areas: data story, goal, strategy, and activity. Note that it is not necessary to adjust every time you monitor. Before you adjust, you are prompted with a series of questions, such as those on the screen. The questions will vary depending on the area of adjustments you are considering, but there is also a general question that you may want to consider before making any adjustments. Do you have the right monitoring tools to give you the information you need to consider adjusting? If so, then consider the questions in the area you're considering. If not, you may want to go back and take a look at your current tools to discern what else you need. Note the following questions regarding the data story. What monitoring data will give you a more complete picture of your plan? If considering adjusting the goal, ask the following questions. Do timelines got interim and end target measures need to be adjusted forward or backward? There may be a tendency to simply extend a target further out if it has not met without analyzing and addressing the needs, for it may not have been met. When considering adjusting the goal, it is critical that the district also consider the rest of the questions in the list, such as what will be the impact of those adjustments? How do the adjustments to the plan affect individual schools or targeted populations? Have you allowed sufficient time for implementation of the plan? Have you allowed time for an implementation dip when implementing a new strategy? Have you provided the supports and resources needed to implement a strategy? If you are considering strategy or activity adjustments, consider the following. Have you allowed time for the implementation dip when implementing a new strategy? Have you provided the supports and resources needed to implement a strategy? Have you completed the activities according to the timeline? Are there barriers to implementation? And if so, have they been addressed? If you determine you need to adjust, click on the tab for the area you wish to adjust. You will also be required to annotate why you are making that adjustment. The portfolio section allows MICIP users who have permissions to generate hundreds of reports. This is achieved by which filters are selected. To produce a monitor report requires these filters, for example. Select goal or goals under the filters. Select strategies and monitoring adjusting under the report section. If you're looking at the district-wide strategy, select all buildings. If you're looking at a particular school, then only select that school. We don't know how many reports can be generated. We know it is in the hundreds. So lots of flexibility when creating reports in MICIP. So the key takeaways today in closing, we invite you to take a minute to review these key takeaways for monitoring. And as you're reviewing these, please take note. This is when we're done with our presentation today, we will open it up for questions. And so these key takeaways may help you fine tune your question for today. So please also review the learning outcomes for today to see if this presentation met these outcomes for you. Following the next slide, we'll ask questions about these and other learning outcomes. So to understand the purpose and role of monitoring and adjust, identify tools that can be used for monitor and adjust, and understand how monitor and adjust work in the MICIP platform. Here is your personal support team. We are here. Some days it feels like 24/7. You can reach us at any time, and we'll be here to help. We also have the service center out of Oakland Schools that also provide you can provide ticket support.